All right. Welcome back to another welcome back to another episode of Cape Ann Today with our state senator Bruce Tarr. Hi, Senator. How are you?
Hi, Heather. It's great to see you. I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Good.
Okay, I know you've been really busy with the budget, the state budget, and with tax relief. So let's talk about both.
So we had a really good budget debate. We considered over 1,000 amendments, and many of those were mine. I filed about 75 of those amendments, and actually we had a very productive budget debate that included a lot of policy items and a lot of different issues. And I won't belabor those today, except to say that we were able to earmark a number of different things for Cape Ann communities, which we think will be helpful. And we are now working with Representative Ferranti to make sure to get those things included in the conference committee report, which will be the reconciliation of the House version of the budget and the Senate version of the budget. And what's interesting about that is, as we've talked about before, there are 6 conferees. 3 of them are appointed by the House and 3 of them appointed by the Senate. And on that conference committee, out of those 6, Representative Ferranti will be one of them, and I appoint one of them. So 2 out of the 6 conferees will actually be folks that have some Cape Ann ties. And of course, I'll be talking to all of the conferees about trying to include the things that we think are important in the budget.
Nice. That's why we elect you.
Well, so thank you for asking about the budget and the tax relief package in the same question, because they are related. And one of the things that is important is we debated the budget in the Senate. I made note of the fact that we needed to include tax relief measures in our portfolio of the things that we're doing this year. And while I had hoped that we would be doing them in the context of the budget, in the budget itself, we didn't do that. The House actually passed a separate budget bill as well. Nice to see your cat. The House passed a separate budget bill and a separate tax relief package, and that's what we are now going to do. But it's interesting that when we debated the Senate budget, it was not clear that there were the dollars set into a reserve fund to make sure that we could account for the tax relief measures. And so I know that you had asked off air a little bit about how that works. And the answer is that there's a balance sheet that accompanied the budget. And there was a notation in that balance sheet for about $575 million that was alleged to be used for the tax relief measures. However, there was no appropriation in the Senate version of the budget for that. So I offered an amendment to try to appropriate the money into a reserve account. And the reason that I did that was so the dollars would be in an account and could not be used for anything else unless the legislature acted to appropriate them for something else. Unfortunately, that measure didn't prevail, but it did spark a very important debate in the Senate about the need to offer tax relief, even as we were spending almost $56 billion of public money on a whole host of other spending priorities.
And I know that you mentioned in our last interview that all of these asks in the budget are important because the budget has to get passed. So if you really want to get it through there, you stick it in the budget to make sure it happens, as opposed to a bill that sort of flounders, right?
It's absolutely right, Heather. We need to have a budget every year. Our Constitution requires it. And one interesting thing about Massachusetts government is our Constitution requires a balanced budget. So we often read about the federal government having a deficit, which is a growing concern, particularly with the discussions that have been happening in our nation's capital about the debt ceiling and things of that nature. We often see other states that wind up having to borrow to balance the budget. Our Constitution doesn't allow that. And so when we work on a budget, it has to be balanced and it has to stay in balance, because there are statutes that require that when it appears that our revenue will not be enough to support our expenditures, the comptroller has to notify the governor. And it's one of those rare instances where the governor actually has the unilateral power to reduce the budget. Those are called Chapter 59C cuts when they occur. I don't think we're going to be at risk of that right now, but it is an interesting aspect of how our government works.
Okay, so in the budget right now, there is no tax relief
There
because,
is not. And I think it's important to go back and understand the history of this as well. You know that we've been trying to get tax relief measures for quite some time, dating back to the original proposal that Governor Baker had made back a couple of years ago. And in fact, the Senate has voted 3 times on a package of tax relief measures. The House has now voted twice on a package of tax relief measures, and yet none of those have reached the governor's desk. And so I've been fairly frustrated that even though the Senate and the House agree on most of the components of what should be in a tax relief package, we still have not gotten it into law. And so I've been very vocal about that, and I intend to continue to be vocal about that. But next Thursday, we in the Senate are slated to debate a tax relief package, which is very similar in many respects to the packages that we have voted on in the past. It includes things like doubling the senior circuit breaker tax credit for our seniors to be able to afford their property taxes and their utility bills, increasing the deduction for renters because we know the cost of rental housing in our area and all across the state is very high, changing the estate tax, which is one of the most negative elements of Massachusetts taxation right now, where the threshold for your state to be taxed is only $1 million. That makes us an outlier, a significant outlier among all the states, and it's something that we have to act on. So that package actually was reported out of the Committee on Ways and Means this morning. You and I are talking on Thursday, and it's important to put that into perspective. And we will have until Monday of next week to file amendments, and we will debate taxes once again in the Massachusetts State Senate next Thursday, starting at about 11 o'clock.
and did you say that the House is working on their own version of the tax relief plan?
So the House, nearly coterminously with debating the budget, passed a tax relief package as well. And many of the elements are similar. One of the notable differences is the House phases in some of the more expensive components of its proposal over a period of years. The current Senate proposal that was reported out by the Committee on Ways and Means does not do that. It accounts for all of it in this fiscal year and the next fiscal year as things go into effect, but doesn't phase things in. And hopefully we'll get to a conference committee. And when we do, that'll be a significant difference that'll have to be worked out by the conferees.
Hmm. Well, we have to talk about this kerfuffle with the jobless benefits. The state erroneously spent $2.5 billion of federal money on jobless benefits.
Yeah.
That money was not intended for that purpose. What was it intended for?
Well, we should talk about that because there's much more to this story.
Okay.
And I think we need to go back in the time machine a little bit. And we all remember what the earliest days of the pandemic were like, when we knew that people couldn't work because of measures that were needed to protect public health. We knew that we had to do something in addition to regular unemployment benefits to help people get through those times. And we know that the federal government was imploring us to be able to get benefits out quickly and was giving us large amounts of money to be able to do that. For instance, I think we all remember the $600 addition that came from the federal government that we added to folks' unemployment benefits. So it was during that time where the rules were changing very constantly. We were being asked to get the money out the door as quickly as we could, that now the federal government is alleging that the Commonwealth spent $2.5 billion for unemployment benefits that should have been paid for with state tax funds as opposed to federal grant money. And there is a good faith dispute about that. And in fact, I've been discussing this with Governor Healy and the Senate President and the Speaker. And we all think that there's more to this than just a simple accounting error. And you have to ask the question, if the federal money that we were getting to assist with the pandemic wasn't for things like helping folks that were unemployed because of the pandemic, what was it for?
Yeah, right, exactly. I actually have, because I was reading a little bit about this, and I have these numbers that are really stunning. In 2019, Massachusetts spent $1.4 billion on jobless benefits. Between 2020 and 2021, they spent $33 billion. That's amazing.
It's a huge amount of money. And in fact, early on, the folks that were making claims overwhelmed the system. And in fact, the folks at the Division of Unemployment Insurance they had to hire literally hundreds of additional employees. And you may recall at the time, we talked about it often, my staff were fielding a lot of those calls and working with the folks at unemployment to be able to expedite those claims. So it was a chaotic time. And the federal government said, here's a lot of money. And it was used to help people. So Governor Healy and the Healy-Driscoll administration have given us assurances that they're going to continue to pursue this with the federal government and really attempt to hold Massachusetts taxpayers harmless, hold the state budget harmless, and really make the case that, number one, Massachusetts was not alone. Many states had these kind of errors. And number two, this was exactly the intent of the dollars that came to us for pandemic relief. So hopefully they'll be able to work that out. I'm cautiously optimistic that they will, because if not, it could have a very significant impact on our state budget and our state spending priorities, even as we're trying to resolve a budget for the coming fiscal year, which begins on July 1st.
Hmm. So returning to the tax relief plan, we don't have to worry about this kerfuffle, the federal government kerfuffle, impacting these bills.
Well, that's an interesting question that I was asked yesterday by the Boston Herald. And my answer was that this tax relief has been something we've been trying to achieve for the better part of a couple of years. And we've had a number of false starts where the House and the Senate have passed it. And the Senate needs to move forward and pass this package so we can get to conference committee and be able to move forward. Ultimately, if we have some responsibility for that $2.5 billion, we will have to find a way to account for it. We have several tools for that, but we shouldn't allow the tax relief that's really important to helping folks cope with the high cost of living in Massachusetts be delayed by this issue. But I won't say that there is no chance that it won't affect what we're trying to do. But what I am saying is we have no time to lose moving forward, getting the best package we can put together, and then weighing our options when we look at the $2.5 billion issue. Now, my sense is that if there is some sort of an agreement that causes the Commonwealth to have to pay back some of these dollars or supplement or supplant the dollars, it would usually be done over a period of years. It's not likely to be something where the federal government's going to hand us a bill and say, you got to pay us $2.5 billion right now. So my opinion is that we need to move forward, and we don't have a moment to lose on tax relief, because over the last several years, and I've said this in Senate floor debate, we've lost 100,000 people in Massachusetts. And part of the reason, certainly not the only reason, but part of the reason is because of the cost of government and just the cost of living in our state. For instance, the rental deduction that I mentioned and the high cost of getting a rental apartment. So in my opinion, we can pursue two paths at once. We don't need to let state government and the budget process and the tax relief process be paralyzed by the significant issue of the $2.5 billion. We have to think about that. We have to be responsible about it, but we can't let it throw us into paralysis.
And I believe a couple of those false starts, or maybe one of those false starts, might have been by the fact that that law was triggered. I forget the number of the law that said that the state has brought in so much tax revenue, now it has to give the citizens back. And we were all refunded a bit. So what was it? What was that number?
So the law you're referring to is Mass General Laws Chapter 62F, which was passed by the voters in 1986. And before last year, the only year that it had actually ever become operative was the following year after it was passed in 1987. And it sets a cap on total revenue that Massachusetts can collect. And when we exceed that cap, it triggers a rebate. And in the case of last year, it wound up being about a 14% rebate on the amount of taxes that someone had paid. And so there were some folks that were surprised by the fact that Chapter 62F was calculated. I don't believe everyone was surprised, because the Ways and Means committees and their staff are in communication with the Secretariat of Administration and Finance that tracks these things. They had actually asked the question before we get into the budgeting process, are we likely to trigger Chapter 62F? So it wasn't a complete unknown, but it certainly, I think, was larger in magnitude than some folks thought. And I think as a result of that, some folks said, well, let's pause and think about the impact of that before we move forward. But I think it's important to distinguish the fact that Chapter 62F is done on a case-by-case basis. So it happened last year. That doesn't mean it will happen next year or the year after that. Whereas the kind of tax relief measures that we're talking about in these respective packages from the House and the Senate are permanent, and they would be part of the landscape going forward.
Well, thank you for describing Chapter 62F so much better than I just did. It's much more, but I do remember when that happened. And did that not sort of pause the whole tax relief package? Like, wait a minute, now we're going to have to pay for these rebates and what? So everything got stalled, right?
It definitely had that impact because at that point, the House and the Senate had passed tax relief measures in the economic development legislation that we did last year. And as a result of the triggering of Chapter 62F, a lot of folks said, let's put things on hold. And that's unfortunate. I think that we certainly could have accommodated both. Governor Baker made that clear in some of his supplemental budget filings, but that's all in the rearview mirror now. And looking forward, we have a chance to finally create some tax relief that people really need as they're continuing to deal with the cost of inflation, the high cost of living, and certainly the cost of meeting their tax burden, both at the local level with property taxes and at the state and federal levels with other kinds of taxation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I know you're going to have to go soon, but tell us about what's happened in Manchester by the Sea this morning.
So I am so excited to talk about this because I think that it is not only important for the project itself, but it's important about moving forward and understanding how we deal with issues of climate change and resilience. So for about the last decade, Manchester by the Sea has been trying to confront an issue with the Central Street Bridge and the Sawmill Brook that runs under the Central Street Bridge and out into the harbor. And the environmental conditions of the brook have been degrading, and the bridge has been deteriorating to the extent that there's been a lot of concern about its structural failure. Now, I wouldn't want to alarm anyone. The bridge does get inspected, and it is safe to travel over right now, but it needs attention, and it needs it soon. And so Greg Fetterspiel, the town administrator in Manchester by the Sea, and the select board have been extremely proactive in saying, how are we going to address this? Because the cost of the project is going to be substantial. And as we know, Manchester by the Sea, in relative terms, doesn't have a lot of taxpayers. So for them to shoulder the whole burden of replacing the bridge and restoring the brook, it really would be difficult. So they worked with the state folks and Representative Ferrante and I, and before that, Representative Hill, and had worked with them. And we had tried to provide some state funding for planning. But what we announced today is that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, through an application that was made by Massachusetts Department of Coastal Zone Management, is providing Manchester by the Sea with $1.3 million toward this project. And so it is a prime example of a very daunting resilience issue that needs to be addressed, a smaller community that doesn't have all the resources in the world to address it, and the complete partnership between state, local, and federal government that is going to get the project done. And in fact, construction is now slated to begin next year. They're still in the design phases, but this project is going to get done. And the point of it is, and there are many points, but a point of it is that if you look at this area of downtown Manchester, it is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. And in fact, there have been some maps that have been produced by the Cape Ann Climate Coalition that are deeply concerning about what could happen in this area. Mm-hmm. This bridge not only provides an important connection along Route 127, so it doesn't just affect Manchester by the Sea, but under the bridge run the two electric lines that supply the rest of Cape Ann with electricity.
Oh my gosh.
So this is incredibly important.
Yeah.
And again, as a result of that collaboration, Manchester by the Sea got a huge boost today. And by the way, there were only 2 communities that got these grants. They were highly competitive on a national basis. Truro was one to our south, and Manchester by the Sea. So it was a great day to be able to announce that and be able to work with the town and our federal colleagues to be able to get this done.
Mm. Well, congratulations to Manchester by the Sea and to everyone who worked on that. That's great.
It is a really great example, and I hope it will motivate other communities to also be proactive and not defer consideration of these kinds of things until there's a failure of some sort that can have extremely negative consequences. Well, thanks, Heather, and thanks to you for this chance to talk. I really appreciate it in our regular interviews, and I also appreciate the fact that we are fortunate enough to have a local cable facility, 1623 Studios, that gives us the chance to have these kind of conversations that can go a little further than what we might be able to read about in the newspaper because of limited space.
Thank you. All right, we'll see you soon.
Thank you.
Interested in a sponsorship? Email sponsor@1623studios.org to learn more.